A very good afternoon, everyone. Bulavinaka, Iakwe, and Talofa, warm Pacific greetings. Today, we are having our 10th Pacific Resilience Partnership webinar, building on the overall resilience theme of our people, our journey, nurturing Pacific resilience from home, with a specific focus on climate resilience, Pacific Youth Pathway to COP26, in an effort to amplify the Pacific voice. Here this afternoon, we have a very good lineup of speakers, and we would like to welcome all our participants, our young people, and other participants who have joined us this afternoon from across the region. We hope that you will be with us for the next 1 hour, 15 minutes. And I would like to briefly introduce our speakers this afternoon. We will have a brief opening remarks from His Excellency George Edger, the UK High Commissioner to Fiji, Tuvalu, and Kiribati, and also Ambassador to the Marshall Islands and Micronesia. We have invited His Excellency, given the UK's role in this year's UK presidency for COP26. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Bulavinaka. I'm very pleased to be able to be here with you, and I want to start by congratulating the organizers, in particular the Pacific Resilience Partnership, for the initiative to set up what I am sure will be a stimulating event. As we approach COP26, resilience in the face of the impacts of climate change is increasingly a focus of international attention. The extent and urgency of the climate crisis has been brought home again by the extreme weather events across the world over the last few months, cyclones and floods, droughts and wildfires, and the most recent IPCC report has only underlined how much we have to do and how little time we have to do it in. And all this is something which sadly has been familiar for some years to the countries of the Pacific, already feeling the impacts of climate change through sea level rise and coastal erosion, through cyclones, and through changing weather patterns. COP26 is the highest priority for the British government as the incoming presidency, and the highest priority for my High Commission and for the UK's diplomatic missions across the Pacific. And adaptation and loss and damage, both very relevant to the resilience agenda, will be among the key issues on the agenda at COP26. Part of that is a conversation, as everybody is keenly aware, a conversation about money. The developed countries are committed to providing $100 billion per year in international climate finance from 2020. In practice, that figure has not yet been reached. And it's also the case that the large majority of international climate finance has supported mitigation, that is, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, rather than adaptation. This is something on which the UK has been pushing hard since we took over as incoming presidency. And under the UK's G7 presidency, significant new commitments were made by the nations who attended the G7 summit in the UK earlier this year. And there's been further positive movement. For example, the commitment made by the US president at the United Nations last week to double the US's climate finance to $11.4 billion per year. The UK announced last year the doubling of our own climate finance, and we are also committed to ensuring that at least half of that goes to adaptation and we're encouraging others to do the same. But adaptation is about more than just international finance. It's about expertise and technology. And through initiatives as incoming COP presidency, not least the the Adaptation Action Coalition, we have been setting up mechanisms to bring countries together to share experience and expertise. And a number of the Pacific countries have been part of that process. Fiji in particular has played a high-profile role, both as co-chair of the coalition and leading on action in relation to climate resilience health systems. That's an issue on which there are actually two high-level meetings this week taking that agenda forward. Adaptation is also, of course, about what happens at the national and the local level, ensuring that resilience needs are built into planning across all sectors. Nature-based solutions in that context will be an increasingly important element in terms of coastal defence, watershed management, climate resilient agriculture. Again, I know better what's been happening in Fiji than other parts of the Pacific, but it's an area where we've seen some very important initiatives taken by governments in terms of harnessing the power of nature to protect against the impacts of climate change. And that's an approach which also in very important ways links up with the protection and restoration of biodiversity and the whole relationship of humanity with nature. As the declaration from last week's Youth for Pacific pre-COP gathering said, we need to be moving from extractive economies to regenerative economies. I think that means in the end a change in the way we think, a change in the way we run our economies. It's a big change which we're only really starting now, but that's going to be at the very center of the agenda over the coming years. A few words about COP26 itself. We want to see this meeting being a turning point in terms of the scale and the urgency with which governments and the private sector act to address the climate crisis. We have 4 priority areas for COP26. The first is to secure a commitment, a global commitment to net zero emissions by 2050 or earlier, and to keep the target of no more than a 1.5 degree global temperature rise within reach. Secondly, we need to urgently adapt to protect communities and natural habitats. Thirdly, we need to mobilize finance. And fourthly, we need to work together to accelerate action. And we need to be sure that as we do that, that the needs and priorities of vulnerable countries, including those in the Pacific, are fully reflected. In most of those areas, not just in finance, we are a long way away from where we need to be to achieve the goals that we have all globally set ourselves. In terms of mitigation in particular, there is a very large gap. The latest figures suggest that the current commitments through countries' NDCs, if fully implemented, would provide for, would actually result in a growth of something like 16% in greenhouse gas emissions between now and 2030. And that's against a required target of a reduction of 45 to 50%. So that's an illustration of how far we are at the moment from the target. But we, as presidency, will keep pushing as hard as we can. And we look both to the governments of the Pacific countries and to other constituencies to push hard for faster, more resolute action by governments. And in that, I think the voice of youth, the voice of young people, has a very important role to play, because young people are the leaders of the future, because young people are those who are going to be affected by the decisions taken now, and because youth advocacy can be extremely powerful and can make a real difference. So with that, I want to wish all of you an interesting and stimulating hour and a quarter to come, and to encourage all of you to take these things, take these issues beyond this session, and make them part of what you do, part of what you act on in your daily lives in order to make that difference that we need. Thank you very much, Binaka.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for the opening remarks and giving us the platform for this webinar. And as you mentioned, young people have been actively engaged, and also they have an active role. And that's one of the purpose of this webinar, is for how young people can support our leaders, can support our national governments, can support our civil society governments, civil society organization, as they prepare towards COP26. And as you mentioned, a lot has happened in the past few months and few weeks. Last week, there was a 2 days pre-COP youth gathering. It was interesting to see that there was also an outcome statement. Also earlier on, there was a Pacific Climate Justice Summit held in August, where young people had also actively engaged. And there was also the PRM Youth Forum held earlier in July. And also currently, there is also a coordinated pre-COP training currently going on this week with the University of the South Pacific. And we'll have a short video played before we move on to our first speaker, Tokasa.
This is a lonely mangrove. It faces cyclone and other natural disaster each year. Mangrove regeneration is one of the hope for residents that are living along the shoreline. Regeneration of mangrove provide protection against coastal erosion and to ease the Pacific Islanders from the rising sea level caused by climate change. Time goes by, more people see the importance of mangrove in the communities. These initiatives have been introduced in schools. Sustainably, this knowledge will be an asset to everyone. I believe that climate change cannot stop, but to protect ourselves, we must plant more mangroves. Then these mangroves won't be alone again.
And now we would like to invite Tokasa Seirimbiao, our youth and children speaker. Tokasa was also our Pacific Resilience Meeting 2021 Youth Forum opening speaker, who is currently a children and youth advocate and champion on DRR and climate with Save the Children.
the Honorable Chief Guest, His Excellency George Edgar, United Kingdom High Commissioner to Fiji, Tuvalu, Kiribati, Marshall Islands, and Micronesia. Excellence, distinguished participants, youth, and children. Bula everyone, my name is Tokasa, and I am a member of the Disaster Risk Reduction Club in Van Lidina community, which is supported by Save Children Fiji. I am so delighted to deliver my speech at this event representing the many voices of children and youth in the region. Before I make my statement, I wish to offer my gratitude to all the frontliners who have been working day and night, leaving their children and families behind in fighting this COVID-19 pandemic. We love you and we appreciate you for all the work that you do. The ocean connects us all Pacific Islanders. The Pacific culture is unique. A journey started off by our ancestors. The Pacific is unique and renowned for its way of knowing and being, which has made us resilient to change over many years, not least through climate change and most recently, COVID-19. We are duty-bound to nurture and sustain our Pacific way of livelihood for our people and for the future generation. However, the change in weather pattern, the climate crisis we're experiencing is affecting us Pacific Islanders, especially youth and children who are the most vulnerable of all. The people of the Pacific have been experiencing the vast effect of climate change and disasters. This is a serious issue, and it is saddening as we young people know that such things are happening to our home, thus leaving us a much rather unsafe and uncertain future for children and youths of today and for the next generation to come. We are currently heading towards the global temperature rise of 3 degrees by the end of the century. To meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario of the Paris Agreement, the world needs to reduce emission by 7.6% per year from 2020 to 2030. We have less than 10 years to act. From climate change induced displacement, loss of tradition and culture, and the very livelihood of families and children, climate crisis is an intergenerational crisis and the greatest threat to youth and children's survival, learning, protection, health, and sustainable livelihood. With this, I urge relevant authorities in the region to join hands and involve us, youths and children, to address the climate crisis at all levels to achieve the framework for resilient development in the Pacific that contributes to the Sustainable Development Goal, especially for the most marginalized and vulnerable young people and their families. Some of the ways that you in authority can support young people see a resilient future is by, number one, acknowledging the climate crisis and that is need to be addressed with youths and children as agents of change. Two, minimizing climate crisis by implementing youth and child-centered projects to support climate adaptive development pathways. Three, get our house in order by reducing our greenhouse gas emission, carbon footprint, and environmental impact. Four, supporting youth and children, including the most marginalized and deprived and young children to influence change. Fifth and lastly, holding state liable for climate-related violation using national justice system and international accountability mechanism. Youth and children play an important role in disaster risk reduction, climate change, disaster preparedness, response, and recovery efforts. Thanks to the Youth and Children Agency and movements that have been increasingly advocating for youth and children inclusiveness in decision-making process and as agent of change. This will continue in contributing to the Pacific voice and engagement at COP26 as we want the relevant authorities to respond, building in what we know works to address climate disaster and being resilient. To all young people in the Pacific who are listening today, let's participate meaningfully in reducing risk and climate change adaptation activities at home, school, and communities. Let's be the voice for young people, hold our leaders accountable, network with each other on innovation and sustainability for our future. Let's ensure that our rights as youth and children to a safe and healthy environment are placed at the center of environmental decision-making and action. To conclude, I would like to end with our youth statement outcome from the Pacific Resilience meeting on the 4 pillars of resilience, that is to integrate, include, inform, and sustain. As for the agencies and decision-making bodies, you have a unique role in working for the legitimacy and power of youth and children, voice, and their leadership in the climate movement. Let's empower and support young people, especially the most marginalized who are disproportionately affected by climate change, to be part of the solution and influence the decision by the world and local leaders that will affect their lives today and tomorrow. Thank you, and Vinakvakalev.
Thank you, Tokasa. It's good to hear from you, and thank you for those encouraging words. And now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Exley Toleburi, a team leader, resilience at the Pacific Islands Forum.
Thank you very much, moderator, excellencies, Pacific youth, officials from government, CSOs, private sector, crop agencies, and the development partners, resilience friends and supporters, good afternoon to you. I also recognize the presence of those that are following us live on Facebook, and also the speakers that are part of this program. Thank you very much for extending the invitation to be part of this webinar this afternoon. I'd like to commend the Pacific Resilience Partnership Youth Working Group and the respective agencies for convening this very important discussion today. I have been asked to provide regional perspectives on what we are doing at the regional level in terms of building our resilience, and also the significance of COP26 and how it aligns to the role of our young people in the Pacific. I would start off by emphasizing that at the regional level, our Pacific Island Forum leaders have recently reaffirmed climate change as the single greatest threat facing our blue Pacific continent in their recent communique last month. This further builds on the earlier reaffirmations in 2019 through the Kainakilua Declaration, and in 2018 through the Boe Declaration on Regional Security. Our leaders also recognize the importance of multi-sectoral and multi-stakeholder approach to addressing climate change and building the resilience of our vulnerable communities. This is through the Framework for Resilient Development in the Pacific, endorsed by Forum leaders in 2016, followed by the endorsement of the Pacific Resilience Partnership in 2017. Despite our best efforts and the Pacific shooting above its weight in terms of the ambitions that our leaders have submitted under the Paris Agreement, our Pacific seats are still very vulnerable to the adverse impacts of climate change. And despite our climate ambition, it would not really have a lot of impact to the global emissions in terms of the negligible contribution that our Pacific seats contribute to the global emissions. It only accounts for 0.03% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. The latest IPCC report that the High Commissioner also made reference to in his remarks confirms what we already know in the Pacific. We all know that the crisis that we are facing is much more serious and pressing than what others may have thought about. Therefore, we need to amplify our Pacific voice at this upcoming COP in Glasgow. This is an opportunity for us to influence other world leaders, mainly those from the wealthy and major emitting countries, to reset our future and ensure that we keep the 1.5 degrees Celsius that is crucial to safeguarding the future of our blue Pacific within reach. And this is a final opportunity to do that, as the window for action is closing very fast. The Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, together with the One Crop Plus team being led by SPREP, we are working very hard over the past couple of months to prepare our countries in the lead up at COP26 and post COP26. There are some initiatives that I'd like to share. One is through the representation and identification of COP26 political climate champions. At the moment, there are 5 senior ministers and at the leader level that have stepped up to champion a number of our priority issues, including finance, ambition, environmental integrity, loss and damage, and oceans. We are also working closely with our Pacific youth through the PIF Secretary General's Pacific Young Climate Leaders Alliance, and we hope to build and coordinate a cadre of different youths across the Pacific, not just targeting COP26, but going beyond COP. I think youth voice is very, very important. In terms of the second issue that I have been asked to provide some perspectives on, which relates to the key priorities for COP26, the High Commissioner and others that have spoken before me have highlighted a number of them. There are a couple of priorities that our leaders have identified in their communique last month. One is to ensure that COP26 finalizes the Paris Rule Book so that we can move away from negotiations and focus on actual implementation. We also would like to see this COP delivering an ambitious outcome that limits global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Climate finance remains a key priority for the Pacific. Developed country partners need to deliver the 100 billion that they committed to, increase their financing for adaptation, identify dedicated funding for loss and damage, and ensure that there is meaningful discussion on the new quantitative climate finance goal post-2025. We also need to ensure that there is new commitment towards net zero carbon by 2050 and stronger NDC commitments by 2030. And finally, our leaders would like to see that the work on oceans, which is very central to our Pacific region, be advanced within the UNFCCC process. Finally, in regards to where I see the role of youth, I just wanted to emphasize all are fighting towards a future that would be more sustainable and resilient for our young Pacific Islanders. And it is for that reason that I think your voice and your participation in the leader is very important. The Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum is also very committed to engaging with the youth, as demonstrated through the PIF-SG's Young Climate Leaders Alliance, but also the fact that he would be there on the ground in Glasgow. This provides an opportunity for our youths that are going to be there in Glasgow at COP26 to provide input and inform the advocacy initiatives that the Pacific Islands Forum would be undertaking in Glasgow. The role of the Pacific, the COP26 political climate champions is also very critical. It's also an entry point that our Pacific Island youth would be able to provide input and shape the messages that they will take on behalf of our region to COP26, particularly when a number of our countries would not be represented at the senior political level. With that, I also think that not all of us would be there at COP26, but we all have a moral duty to ensure that we safeguard the future of our Pacific youth and children from the climate change impacts that's facing us. With that, thank you very much, and I'm happy to respond to any questions later on. Thank you very much, moderator.
Thank you very much, Exley, for sharing with us this afternoon and for highlighting some of the key outcomes or relevant outcomes, particularly pertaining to our leaders, such as the leaders communique, which is very, very useful. And also thank you for providing your insight in terms of the important role of young people as we build up to COP26 and how they can also play an effective role to support the Pacific voice, but most importantly, our national governments and our civil society organizations who are preparing for COP26. And now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Kushal Raj, who is the Acting Manager, Climate Change and Ocean Specialist from the Ministry of Economy, Government of Fiji.
Thank you, Sevaloni. Are you able to hear me well?
Yes.
Loud and clear, Mr. Kushalraj.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The British High Commissioner, His Excellency Mr. George Edgar, the Ambassador of the Republic of the Marshall Islands to Fiji, colleagues from crop agencies, youth activists, and invited guests. Bula Vinaka and a warm welcome to you all. I would like to thank the Pacific Resilience Partnership, the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, SPREP, and USP for putting forward this event and for giving me the climate change and the international division an opportunity to speak at the Climate Resilience Pacific Youth Pathway to COP26 webinar. Pacific Island nations have come a long way in terms of combating climate change. The fight has been a very vigorous and a challenging one, with many lives, homes, and islands lost along the way. We have had to face the impact of climate change firsthand, despite only contributing about 0.03% of total greenhouse gas emissions globally. The level of our emissions is not near comparable to the scale of disasters and climate change related issues we have been subjected to. For Fiji, our role as climate champions in the Pacific is not to leverage ourselves within the international arena, but rather a responsibility that we have to our blue Pacific continent and to our island neighbors. To answer our challenges, it is very simple. Climate change mitigation today prevents climate adaptation tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, our collaborative and regional approach to ensuring increased resiliency is more pragmatic when considering the positive global implications. From achieving carbon neutrality within our maritime sector to a more holistic approach to increased resiliency, the Pacific is trailblazing efforts within the ambit of climate change with a focus on providing a better world for our youth. Fiji recognizes the importance of youth's participation, and this is pinned in the very implementation of climate change adaptation and mitigation projects as articulated in the National Climate Change Policy, the National Adaptation Plan, the newly launched Fiji's National Ocean Policy, and engagements of youths and community activities through the Ministry of Youth and Sports in Fiji. Ladies and gentlemen, how can we support, strengthen, and align the Pacific voice and to complement the planning and preparation towards COP26? In order to do that and building up to COP26, it is important that we as the Pacific realize the potential we have if we stand together in solidarity for what our region deserves and needs. This includes financial compensation for all the damage our island homes have had to face firsthand in the impact of climate change. Young people will be drastically affected by climate crisis and need the knowledge and skills to tackle it. Partnership provides a platform for young people to discuss climate change with other young people and in other parts of the world. We must focus on how young people perceive climate change, how it affects their lives, and what actions they prioritize in their own context. Youth dialogues are an important aspect in this regard, and key lessons from these experiences should be taken into consideration, including the role of youths in providing a space for young people to voice their own views, perspectives, and experiences on climate change based on what happens in the communities. This enriches and expands the one mode, one science, climate science. Youth dialogues offer a platform for North-South exchange and explore how young people in different parts of the world are affected by climate change. The dialogues provide peer-to-peer format creates a space for interaction on an equal footing. Instead of using top-down transmission to information, this format helps break down walls and foster better interactions. Despite cultural differences and vast distances toward them, participants are able to learn from each other. Taking part allows youths to reflect more deeply on the link between climate learning and climate action. Past participants have said that they felt more motivated to change their habits following a dialogue, and many have also become agents of influence and change in their families, friends, and amongst communities. Ladies and gentlemen, Fiji has been building up to COP26 with the hope that this time around we will grasp all the needed attention for our climate crisis. This is not only for our country, but for our region as well. In March this year, 200 Fijian youths from around the country shared their experiences and knowledge at a 3-day National Youth Climate Action Summit, which aimed at advancing youth-led community initiatives and provided vital youth inputs to the Fijian government on the climate change bill. Events as such empower youth and give them a sense of responsibility of our fight on climate change. The Honorable Prime Minister of Fiji said while opening the first National Climate Change Action Summit that your nation is setting an example we hope the entire world will follow. And by acting now, each of you, the young hearts and minds in this room, will drive action in your homes and classrooms, in your communities, and in all of Fiji, in the Pacific and in the world. In his closing speech, the Minister for Youth and Sports also ensured youths that the National Climate Change Dialogue is not a standalone event, but was the beginning for youth involvement in Fiji's climate action. With 1/3 of Fiji's population under the age of 35, young people in this country have immense potential to positively influencing the development of the country. The National Summit, including youth participants from registered youth clubs around the community and country, came at an opportune time as the government was undertaking national consultations on the climate change bill, which is now the National Climate Change Act. The new knowledge and ideas that were shared amongst the youth will support communities to act on climate change as well as amplify Pacific youth voices for COP26 this year. Becoming agents of change was one of the main keynote takeaways for the Youth Summit. The key message in their submission from the youth was to add that the need for collective action on the climate crisis that we are currently facing is the most vital challenge for youths. Additionally, the youths were able to share with each other real-life issues on how climate change is affecting each other's livelihoods in the community. Our very own youth climate activist who has presented at COP before, Mr. Timothy, was also present in the summit and appealed to over 200 youth participants to become agents of change. Fiji is committed to achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050. We are a major emitter and we all know that. We are not a major emitter and we all know that. Despite that, and in terms of statistics, Fiji only contributes about 0.006% of total greenhouse gas emissions, but that does not make us too small to make a difference. No nation is. And we have a groundbreaking climate change act that will keep us accountable to our net zero ambition. The climate change is what we will take to COP26 as we start implementation of our climate objectives. And indeed, this will capture the climate emergency that we face today. Apart from the National Youth Climate Summit, the pre-COP opportunities for youth and the Climate and Driving Action Summit provides this added participation for youths. And while there is participation, from the Pacific who are extremely driven, vocal, ambitious in their roles in fight against climate change, we have many participants from Fiji and the Pacific attending to the pre-COP Youth Summit. In addition to that, the Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change are one such organizations campaigning to seek an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on climate change and human rights. We believe youths should be able to also demand justice from the international fora, and the Pacific Island Student Fighting Climate Change will be taking this battle to COP26 this year. In addition to that, the Youth for Climate Summit invites 400 young people from all over the world on the margins of pre-COP in Italy that will help address the main urgencies and priorities of climate action by working around 4 themes. Each theme corresponds to a working group which will be led by 2 people, a youth rep and a senior expert. The thematic areas covered in the Youth Ambition Summit this year is, of course, driving ambition, sustainable recovery, non-state actors engagement, climate conscious society, and to name a few, for example. So these, of course, the strong youth dialogue will ensure that at the pre-COP, we are able to capture interest of youth participants and voice their opinions towards COP26. In addition to that, the Pacific Youth Statement towards and beyond COP26 was recently organized, and of course, as you've heard from His Excellency, close to 610 young people registered from over 33 countries around the world. This makes this event one of the largest youth gatherings for the Pacific ahead of COP26 in Glasgow. There are various Talanuas and Momentums organized in the Pacific Youth Summit, and the Youth for Pacific pre-COP gathering provided an opportunity for young people to come together and engage in discussions with the COP26 presidency, regional governments, crop agencies, CSOs, and NGOs. On the final day, the youths came up with the Youth for Pacific Declaration outlining their priorities for COP26. This will be presented to the COP26 presidency and regional leaders as the voices of the young people in the region. Supported by the UK government, the gathering builds up the momentum of youth efforts towards accelerating climate action in the region. The Youth for Pacific pre-COP gathering was organized with Active Citizens Pacific, Sustainable Ocean Alliance, and 350.org Pacific. Apart from that, ladies and gentlemen, the Action for Climate Empowerment is a term adopted by the UNFCCC to denote work under Article 6 and Article 12 of the Paris Agreement. And the role of ACE is to really empower all members of the society, including youths, to engage in climate action through education, training, public awareness, public participation, public access to information, and international cooperation on these issues. At the national level, this provides further opportunities for youths to engage in a more meaningful implementation of the Paris Agreement. Ladies and gentlemen, as I come towards the conclusion, the Pacific's mission is crystal clear. We must keep the 1.5-degree target alive in recognition of the shocking results published in the recently launched Working Group AR6, the Physical Science Basis Report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This means demanding drastic emission cuts by the year 2030 that will put large nations on a path towards net zero emissions before 2050. With this mentioned, I would also like to challenge all our regional countries by stating that Fiji has legislated a net zero carbon emissions target by 2050. This, in addition to our climate change bill, will be the future forward for Fiji in setting forward our emissions target. Lastly, I would like to reiterate that we as PCs have a stronger voice if we stand together, hence collectively amplifying what we need. Immediate and honest action from bigger countries will definitely make a stamp in the global arena. Moreover, I would like to commend everyone for the great effort taken in making all these meetings and to the build-up to COP26, in particular, the excellent role undertaken by the UK presidency in organizing the various negotiations, including youth participation. This also radiates our strength and resilience as island nations, and we hope that the legacy for COP26 will not only build up from the Youth Summit and youth participation, but will ensure and enshrine through the finalization of the Paris Rulebook. Thank you, and Bula Vinaka.
Thank you, Kushal, for sharing with us this afternoon. It's greatly appreciated. Thanks for sharing some concrete examples from Fiji, and also for highlighting some of the outcomes that have been generated in a number of youth fora in Fiji, such as the National Youth Climate Summit, which was held earlier on in March, and also the pre-COP gathering, and also highlighting the current pre-COP youth event that's also happening this week in Milan, where we also have a number of young people who are engaging. Thank you. And now I would like to introduce our last speaker for this segment, His Excellency Trega Alban Yashoda, the Ambassador of the Republic of the Marshall Islands to Fiji.
Bula Vinaka, Yahweh. Thank you, Sebuloni. Yahweh, good afternoon to everyone. Let me first start by acknowledging His Excellency George Edgar, our great partner from the presidency of COP26, for his presence and for his continued engagement on this issue on behalf of his government. Secondly, I want to acknowledge the organizers of this meeting for allowing me the opportunity to come here and speak to young people. One of my passion is addressing young people, particularly in this role that I have experienced some elements within climate change, including. So thank you for that. I will divert a little bit from the expectation of my statement this afternoon, because I believe that the previous speakers have covered adequately what's necessary moving forward to COP26 in Glasgow. But I will just share some of my observation and lessons, and perhaps challenge the young people in the audience as we move towards Glasgow towards the end of the year. So 2 decades ago, I myself was a young person. At 23, I was already delving into the fairly new tool, the Geographic Information System, or GIS, and trying to map mangroves in one of the outer island atolls of the Marshall Islands, and also trying to map traditional marine and terrestrial conservation sites. A huge part of my investment in these works was my personal curiosity in my cultural connection to the ecosystem. Little did I know at that time that I was about to embark on a lifelong journey of passion for culture and ecosystem conservation, activism, advocacy, and diplomacy. I was also content that my journey of learning will never stop. In 2014, RMI hosted the meeting of the Cartagena Dialogue in Majuro. And during that time, our USB campus coordinators in Majuro approached me, provide guidance on their subjects, particularly on climate science. And I admit I'm not a climate scientist then, and I am still not a climate scientist now. But I provided an alternative and asked them to organize, or the organizers to consider doing a mock Cartagena dialogue negotiation on the issues that we're also negotiating convergence around, such as the NDCs, which then in 2014 were known as the Nationally Determined Commitments, and other works to accelerate the post-2020 targets. We dubbed the meeting the Road to Lima and Onward to Paris. In our official negotiations, member countries agreed on some key elements for post-2020 targets, including the 5-year cycle review. But through hard negotiations and compromise, the mock session of young people, however, came out with an even better and remarkable outcome position that not only looked at the post-2020 targets, but raised the ambitions. Interestingly, they were mentored and coached by the real negotiators from the countries that were participating in the Cartagena dialogue, such as Germany, Indonesia, Ethiopia, France, Panama, Peru, and other members. In 2015, led by then Minister of our Foreign Affairs, Tony de Broom, and a group of young activists and champions joined our national delegation to UNFCCC in Paris, which concluded in the Paris Agreement, a milestone achievement for our young champions in the Marshall Islands. In 2018, our Marshall Islands Student Association, comprising of both USB and FNU students, launched their regional campaign on nuclear activism. One of their first tasks was to present to the regional high-level meeting on the preparatory work on Sustainable Development Goal 14, or OCEAN, and in particular, calling for mitigation from existing pollutants, including radioactive materials. Fast forward to 2021, and I'm pleased to say that many of these young people and champions are continuing their work on the multifaceted interdisciplinary work surrounding climate change and nuclear justice, taking on both public and civil society roles in developing policy frameworks, national, regional, and global communications and advocacy, and high-level representation diplomacy in climate and nuclear justice. And the two key factors in their work are people and environment. Today, I am mentoring 3 young people in addressing emissions from international shipping. 2 of them are currently involved in regional policy framework on transitions of our regional and domestic shipping and international negotiations in IMO, and 1 in international maritime law. Now, I told you these stories because when I was thinking about what I would say to you today, I couldn't help but recall my personal connection to young people's active engagement and participation in these issues. This is extremely important for me, that young people have their voices heard, because you will inherit what we leave behind. And it is important that you are given all the opportunities. Sorry. I told you that story because when I was thinking about what I would say to you today, I couldn't help but recall my personal connection to young people's active engagement and participation in these issues. This is extremely important for me that young people have their voices heard because you will inherit what we leave behind. And it's important that you are given all the opportunities you need to understand and comprehend these issues to be able to desynthesize the complexities of our current climate emergency and the ongoing negotiations. From a national context, RMI is extremely privileged to have so many young people expressing concerns and participating in activities that raise awareness among their peers and communities. We have active young people's groups like NGOs such as Jojigum, CMI's Nuclear Club, the MISA for the Pacific Students, MICS or the Marshall Islands Conservation Societies, and other organizations across the US for our diaspora, led by young people. We have government programs with young people and adaptation strategies on building resilience through maintaining ecosystem integrity, through conservation and resource management, or the Marshall Islands Youth Services and TVET programs that addresses vocational upscaling of skills in the green revolution. We have young peoples engaged in international organization support through the International Organization of Maritime, International Organization of Migration, and the International Federation of Red Crosses and Red Crescents, partnerships in humanitarian and social awareness from migrations. In short, we have a number of young champions that are pushing climate and nuclear issues in different fora, domestically, regionally, and internationally, but we need more. As we prepare for Glasgow, there are some key specific elements of the negotiations that we need to focus on. For example, one of the key components for PCITS in Glasgow will be to ensure that global emissions this decade is peaked if we are to realize a 1.5 degree temperature goal of the Paris Agreement. Financing commitments of $100 billion are met and disbursed immediately for PCITS and others to mitigate and adapt to impacts of climate change. We need to prioritize adaptation and drive the progress in global goal on adaptation. And the Warsaw Mechanism on Loss and Damage and the Santiago Network of Loss and Damage needs to be also prioritized. On common timeframes on NDCs, we need to ensure that reporting on NDCs are consistent, comparable, and transparent to support the established system we agreed to in Paris. And we need a collective push for Article 6 to safeguard environmental integrity, and agree to work on new programs that addresses empowerment, education, and training, and access to information, and also program of work for local communities and indigenous peoples. These are key issues that we need to take on in Glasgow. The difficulty is many of us won't be there due to our own travel restrictions to safeguard our communities from the ongoing pandemic. But the other thing that I think is extremely important for me to say is this. We know what we need to achieve in Glasgow, but do we have a sustained regional capacity to go beyond Glasgow? This is my challenge to you young people today. In whatever discipline you are considering your specialized future to be in, put people at the center of your decision, be it family, community, nation, or region, but put people at the heart of your decisions. You see, for each of those key components we need to achieve in Glasgow and beyond, we need experts in statistics, demography, economics, both micro and macro, health, social welfare, anthropology, law, engineering, technology, information communications, ecosystems, arts, culture, and the list goes on. And most importantly, we need the next generation of leaders to advocate for our Pacific values and cultural diversity and lens. Your advocacy is extremely important. However, the role you play after your advocacy should be equally important. As the future leaders of this region, whatever your future calling becomes should be central to the people of your region. My departing thoughts for you is to move away from the thinking in linear, because linear concepts are so overrated and such a foreign concept. Start thinking in the spiral concept, with family at the innermost center of your spiral, because our climate fight has never been linear. It's spiral like the inner shell of the Nautilus. So be adaptable and never stop learning. In conclusion, let me join Takasa in calling on regional governments to actively engage and participate young people in all discussions that relate to them, particularly this one, and our development partners to facilitate the resourcing of these participation and engagement of our young people. I thank you very much for your attention, Komol-Dada, and I wish you all a good deliberation in your session. Komol-Dada.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Your Excellency, for sharing with us, particularly from your real life experiences as a young person, and relating it to this specific webinar. I think it is really appreciated. And also thank you for reinforcing the message by our children and youth speaker earlier. So colleagues, this is where we will wrap up our first segment of our 4 key speakers. We will have a short video played after this. And after this session, I will hand over to my co-moderator, Ms. Vivian Costa, who will continue our last segment for briefing on COP26 question and answer session before we officially close and end. Thank you.
My name is Navi.
My name is Rocco.
My name is Stuart. A lot has changed.
The environment I grew up in and the environment that I currently live in are very different.
So if we don't look after the earth now, the future generation would be devastated because of our actions today.
We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow from our children.
Our souls can connect with that of the earth if we look after it and realize that we are part of it.
Yes, I think we still have a chance to save our earth.
And now I see the sunrise. Now I feel glorious, glorious. I feel glorious, glorious.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vivian Costa, and I'm a member of the Pacific Resilience Partnership Working Group on Youth along with Sevloni. This section is really the provision of two briefs on COP26. And first up, we have Ms. Valentina Spinetti from the UN in the Pacific office. She's based with the Resident Coordinator's Office as the Youth and Climate Change Outreach Officer. So please go ahead, Valentina.
Thank you, Vivian. Ritesh, if you could start presenting, please. Thank you very much. Thank you to the moderator, the organizers, and Dear Excellency, Ambassador, CSO's representatives, youth activists, development partner representatives, crop agency representatives, fellow UN colleagues, and to the audience listening to us. I've been asked to provide a brief presentation on COP26, and it will bring together some of the details that have been brought forward by our fellow speakers and kind of bring it together. If you could move to the first slide. So, as previously mentioned by the British High Commissioner, there's several goals that have been set by the COP26 presidency, and I would like to go over again and kind of maybe add more details on them. The first one is that to secure global net zero goals by mid-century and keeping within the 1.5 degrees within reach. And countries are being asked to come forward with ambitious 2030 emissions reductions targets, which align with reaching the net zero by the middle of the century. And in order to deliver on these targets, countries will need to accelerate the phase out of coal, significantly reduce deforestation, speed up the switch to electric vehicles, and encourage investment in renewables, and make stronger commitments to the nationally determined contributions. The second one, which is very relevant for our Pacific region, is through adaptation and to adapt in order to protect communities and natural habitats. In fact, the climate is already changing and it will continue to change even more, even as we reduce emissions with devastating effects. And it's very important that at COP26, we work together in order to enable and encourage countries which are affected by climate change to protect and restore ecosystems and biodiversity, and to build defenses, warning systems, and a resilient infrastructure and agriculture to avoid loss of home, livelihoods, and lives. The third goal is to mobilize public and private sector finance. In fact, in order to deliver on on the first two goals, the developed countries must come through with their promise to mobilize at least 100 billion in climate finance per year by 2020. An international financial institution must play their part and work together towards unleashing public and private sector finance, which is required to secure the global net zero goal. And the fourth goal is to work together to deliver. In fact, we can only deliver on these challenges and really solve the climate crisis by working together. And the aim is that at COP26, the Paris rule book is finalized, and that there is accelerated action to tackle the climate crisis through collaboration between governments, businesses, and civil society. If we can move on to the next slide, please. These are some of the UN priorities for COP26, and the first one is mitigation, and we need stronger ambition on mitigation with a 45% cut in emissions by 2030 in order to reach carbon neutrality by mid-century. In fact, the nationally determined contributions that are currently in place would still result in an increase of 16% by emissions by 2030. And this would bring us to a catastrophic pathway moving forward. The second focus for the UN is finance. We need more ambition on finance, and in particular, there is still some areas that are problematic for the region. There is data deficiency in the Pacific, and also capacity are key issues that is preventing the Pacific from really making climate financing available. Additionally, UNCDF is developing a climate disaster risk financing framework and paramedic insurance in Fiji, which aims to alleviate economic damage which is caused by climate and extreme weather events that through financing instruments for Fijians. As we know, our region is very susceptible to extreme weather events, and hence this mechanism will help alleviate some of the damage. The next point is adaptation and resilience. And as I previously mentioned in the UK presidency goals, adaptation is very important, and there needs more ambition on adaptation. We need to establish a clear process to define the global goal on adaptation, which is contained in the Paris Agreement. And we need to commit some of the, at least 50% of that climate finance to adaptation with regular reviews of the goals and targets. And also we need to allocate proceeds from market mechanism activities under the Paris Agreement Article 6 to the adaptation fund. The next point that it's very important is loss and damage. In fact, the consequences of the developed world's failure to cut emissions adequately are resulting in permanent loss and damage for the most vulnerable, both vulnerable states and within states, the most vulnerable groups in the population. And it's important to call for adequate loss and damage financing and provide operational technical assistance to developing countries through the Santiago network on loss and damage. The next point and final one that I want to mention is implementation. In fact, governments must, by COP26, finalize rules on transparency, carbon training, and common timeframes for accelerated action. If you can move to the next slide. The support by the UN Pacific is provided in different ways, and there, as you can see, and has been already mentioned by previous speakers, the main element of negotiations is done through the One Prop Plus mechanism, of which several UN agencies are part of, and it's led by SPREP. And there are several other studies and reports that have been written during these months, and support has been provided through several events and coordination. Some focuses that have been at the forefront of the work in the UN in the Pacific is to build resilience, disaster, and climate change, and UN Women has been at the forefront through that, and to support the increased access to equitable, affordable climate resilience and sustainable services in WASH through UNICEF. Also, UNCDF is organizing a side event on climate adaptation at COP26. And UNDP has also provided operational support to the Fiji government for the intersessional meetings. And I would like to highlight that the UN work in the Pacific is carried out by 26 resident agencies. And we, through the Pacific Strategy, which is our strategic framework, we coordinate approaches to support all the countries in the Pacific. And there are 6 main outcome areas, of which outcome group 1, which is the most relevant for this topic, is climate change, focuses on climate change, disaster resilience, and environmental protection. And the aim is that by 2022, people and ecosystems in the Pacific are more resilient in the impacts of climate change, climate variability, and disaster, and environmental protection is strengthened. And finally, in the last slide, we can move to the, thank you. I wanted to show some of the upcoming events which are coming for COP26, and particularly I would like to focus on the Youth for Climate event, given that it's particularly relevant for our event today and it's taking place today. It's convened by the government of Italy and it takes place from the 28th to the 30th and provide youth delegates with an unprecedented opportunity to put forward ideas and concrete proposals on some of the most pressing issues on the climate agenda. And the first 2 days are dedicated to working groups, and the last day features a discussion between the young delegates and the ministers attending pre-COP26 to make sure that their ideas are actually brought forward and fed into the mechanism of COP26. And the proposals that are put forward by the young participants will be made available to the subsequent international negotiations on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the debates in ECOSOC and UNFCCC. And I want to highlight how it's really important, and this has been also mentioned by previous speakers, that these events like today, that the one taking place today is then fed, the outcomes are fed into an institutional mechanism to bring forward the role of children and youth. In fact, children and youth, and specifically in the Pacific, have demonstrated an active role in finding climate change solutions, and they will be the future leaders. And we have to encourage and create partnerships with governments, civil society, organizations, development partners, and private sector to enable them to contribute effectively to policy development and social mobilization at both grassroots, national, and regional level. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Panetti, for that outline of the UN work on COP26. You did make mention of the One Crop Plus mechanism, which is led by SPREP. And so we're quite fortunate to have Ms. Tangaloa Cooper, who's the Director of Climate Change and Resilience, with the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program, or SPREP, who will give us a brief on the COP26 preparations. Over to you, Tangaloa.
Hello, Talofa, and thank you very much for the kind introduction. Vivian, lovely to see you again. May I first take this opportunity to convey to all of you from the Director General of SPREP our gratitude for the opportunity, and also our greetings to you. In particular, Your Excellency George Edgar, as well as Your Excellency Alban. Nice to see you again, both of you. And to my regional colleague Exley, as well as to our national participant and speaker, Kushal, here today, as well as our UN representative, Valentina. Greetings to you all. I take this opportunity to greet in particular the young and very talented Tokasa. Whilst I enjoy hearing from our colleagues, and because of the work that we do, we have a shared passion. But when you hear it from a child who has a representative voice, it is very different, because you represent the voice of the Pacific, the real voice. We're here to pave the way to allow you to use your voice when you get here. And in a way, you're here, you're already here. What we'd like to do is encourage you and keep the momentum going. And when you hear, when you would have heard the previous speakers, beginning from the moderator, Sevuloni, and then from His Excellency George Edgar, and the personal experiences of His Excellency Alban Ishoda, that sets, I think, the right platform. And our role is to support you in how you take it the rest of the way. But I have a job here today. I just wanted to acknowledge all of you first. And my job today is to provide you the One Crop update. And I think it segues quite nicely into this presentation from Valentina's presentation. And as Vivian said, SPREP leads the One Crop. Can I just give you young people the context? The Council of Regional Organizations is made up of your USP, FFA, SPC, SPREP, and the Forum Secretariat. It is a One Crop Plus, and the plus are the people that we work very closely with, UNDP, like Valentina, UNEP, as well as PIDF. So it is the One Crop Plus. Whilst we are in the lead, and whilst we lead this work of bringing all the organizations together and to gather the knowledge, technical input to support our countries, this work is driven by the organizations in their own very right, and the technical expertise that they bring to the table. So as a group, we decided to work together for the best benefit of our countries. Can I then start by saying, while we look at the priorities of the UK COP presidency, and we look at We then move to what are the priorities of our region, and your countries, your governments, our people in government, our leaders have agreed that there are 7 priority, shared priority areas in the negotiations, and they include climate finance, the ocean climate nexus, adaptation, loss and damage, markets in Article 6, environmental integrity, and technology and capacity building. All of these priorities will be supported by the one group that will provide the support to our governments that will go. I can confirm today that there are 14 Pacific Island parties to the UNFCCC. And of those 14 Pacific Island parties, 12 countries, 12 Pacific SIDS will be represented at the COP, at COP26. And we have had many logistical problems. Whilst along the way and along this journey this year, we've encountered many obstacles. What remains clear is the dedication and the determination by our leaders to be represented at the COP, because this is not just another COP. This is the COP. This is where the Paris Agreement needs to be finalized. It is where we expect large industrial nations to make meaningful NDC contributions. We expect to see the plans to implement the intentions. And most of all, it is where we expect that people just stop the talking and start the action. Of the 12 countries that have committed to attending, 7 of those countries of the Pacific will be sending leaders. And I cannot recall, but Exley, my colleague and friend from the forum, they work with the climate change champions. There are 5 ministers and leaders who will champion our issues at the COP. But in addition to that, we are doing a lot of preparatory work with our governments, with our officials in the governments. We've had some profile workshops to really look at detail at the issues. We will have the preparatory meeting the first week of October as we prepare to go to Glasgow. But I think the most exciting thing, and this is where we really need your help and your support, is in our campaigns, because I think you are the experts here and we can learn a lot from you. We have a pavilion, we've always had, well, within the past 2 years, we've had a pavilion. And this year, because of the restrictions of COP, because of the global pandemic, social distancing, we're unable to have the large pavilion event that the Pacific has become famous for. The first year we had the Coronivia Pavilion and partnered with Fiji and New Zealand. And the next year in Madrid, we had the Moana Pacific Blue Pavilion. And we partnered with Fiji and New Zealand again. This year, it is a much smaller space, but New Zealand has partnered with us to create that space for Pacific delegates. It is a space where our people can prepare, our people can have bilaterals, and where people can strategize through the negotiations throughout the 2 weeks. And it is the home for us, away from home, for those 2 weeks. I think the exciting stuff is really the campaigns, the media campaigns. And this is where we need your help and your skills. We've got 2 campaigns going. One is the Flex for 1.5. You heard Kushal talk about our priority is keeping to the 1.5. So we have a media campaign, which is a Flex for 1.5. It will commence 3 weeks prior to the COP, up and at the COP, to and at the COP. And then we have a Mana Moana campaign. Now these campaigns and all of our preparations come together under what we call a Pacific Voyage Plan. And so this plan outlines for 2 years how we support countries' negotiations, how we support countries in amplifying their voice, and how we will roll this out and socialize it, sensitize it to much wider audiences. So we're working across many agencies, and this campaign is led by SPRINT. The key components that I'd like to talk to you today are the Flex for 1.5 digital campaign, which will be driven through TikTok, and we have the support of TikTok to do this. They're quite excited to work with the Pacific, so we look forward to that. We also have a large art campaign at COP26 and after COP26. We will collaborate with Pacific artists, high-level champions in the engagement, and the Pacific spaces at the COP in order to raise Pacific visibility. We not only need the COP to know we've arrived, we need the COP to know, and our other parties of the COP to know that we have arrived and we will stay the course, because we have a moral authority to do that. This is quite exciting times, scary but exciting, and we're working on different aspects to this campaign so that we're seen louder, heard louder at this COP, and where there is a chance that we would have a limited Pacific attendance due to circumstances, we have to be even more visible. That said, at the moment, I can convey that we plan to be there with 100 other Pacific Island officials, give or take. And that's not a formal number, it's an approximate number based on the information that we have gathered. We've decided this time we will focus on our high-level participants, our digital audiences on social media, and appeal to people through their emotions with art and that campaign, as well as our ongoing opportunities such as side events, media events, and promotional products for visibility. There are several that we would like to encourage Pacific youth to be a part of. And in particular, we invite you and need your support to help us to drive a strong movement. We want to be heard and seen in virtual spaces as well. And I know that you are experts in this work, in this area. The TikTok campaign will revolve around a dance challenge, transitioning into showing us what people are doing in order to achieve 1.5 on social media. What we hope to achieve is that visibility online in virtual spaces, getting conversations happening and supported in social media amongst those that grew up with the internet. Okay, maybe not myself and Ambassador Albon, but those that grew up with the internet, the 18 to 40-year-olds. For this, we need to have a strong Pacific voice. We need your support, we need your content, and we need all of this to roll out the Flex for 1.5 on social media. We have a strong base that is driving interest, actually, and discussion on our presence in social media. But we need our Pacific youth to help us grow this movement that surrounds negotiators, that there is a swell outside that is propelling the desire for change inside the corridors of the COP. We're in the process of finalizing the creative aspect of this, but once it is in the state that we will be ready to bring to you and work with you, we will reach out through these platforms and these youth partners. If you're interested, please drop a line to our comms advisor, and her email is very easy to remember. It's just nanetw@spread.org. We can share that information and just put Flex for 1.5 in the subject header so her team can reach out to you to help be part of this movement. What we ask is that you find some time and some space in your plans to share and promote so that we can have a larger following. and a global following. If you want to know more, please contact us and just put in the subject flex for 1.5. We will continue throughout this year to next year. Once we've built a momentum, we need to keep it moving, and whether that will transition into a next phase, we are yet to see. But we will keep breathing energy and life into it so that we are not forgotten. That is our challenge. That is our shared challenge. That is my challenge to you, to amplify our voice, to support your negotiators from your governments by making this virtual digital platform one that people will never forget. And we're really fortunate to have the support of New Zealand in this, and the partnership of large companies, and even more excitingly, excited about this is TikTok. So I just want to end there and say a big whakatele lava from the Pacific Climate Change Centre to all of you. And I do wish you all the best in the work that you do. Continue moving, keep pushing, because this is your Pacific. You have one Pacific. We have one Pacific. So we need to push for 1.5 to save our Pacific. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tangaloa, for that exciting challenge to take part in those TikTok videos. I have to admit, I probably won't be doing that myself, but I have many people that I'll be sharing that with. And I'm pretty sure that people have already started preparing themselves to put together some very exciting videos. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our webinar, and just because of time, we aren't able to take questions. But do please feel free to get in touch with any of the speakers that have shared with us today, and including the Pacific Resilience team. That you know, if you have those questions, and we could help you in any way. Your Excellencies, High Commissioner Edgar and Ambassador Ishoda, Tokasa, Exley, Kushal, Valentina, and Tangaloa, thank you so much for sharing with us. Today has been an opportunity to learn and to reinforce a lot of the ideas that we may have already had. Thank you also to the Forum Secretariat, the Pacific Resilience Partnership, in particular the Youth Working Group, and of course you, our audience from across the region and beyond. Once again, we have been reminded that young people of the Pacific are very concerned about the climate crisis, and importantly, about ensuring that our communities remain resilient. And this has been played out over and over again in terms of the many ways in which young people have gotten themselves together to plan their actions, to plan their advocacy, not only for COP26, but for the climate crisis itself in many forms. I'd like to leave us with the reminder that Tokasa shared at the very beginning of this webinar, and that is that we are duty bound to nurture our Pacific. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending today. Please take care.
Over thousands of years, the world always shifts. The wind blows, the sun sails, the wave rock the oceans, and all what is natural lies in harmony. In this age, we feel the whole of the winds, the scorching burn of the sun, the roars of the wave, and the bruises nature had brought on us. It fell to our bodies and spirits. This framework is to protect our land, our culture, our people. While the waves, skies, and the sun are calm, we make the effort to prepare ourselves before words come to us. When the disaster happens, we are ready. Our people are safe. Our fight is our resilience. To preserve our culture, our way of life, our very lives, and we make our resilience to protect our men, women, and children. Our resilience is made to fight back and to save ourselves. We, for the sake of our future, must stand. We, for the sake of our future, must not fail. Where we stand, we never fail. We stand on our ground, fighting for our people, and maybe even the worst came and we wait on better days. We sleep at night peacefully, knowing that we work to protect our children and are working to protect our children's children. Our resilience, our fight, our lives.